Something has never added up. And the more you look at the final 24 hours of Michael Jackson's life, the more you realize that what the world was told, and what actually happened, are two very different stories. Because on the morning of June 25, 2009, a man who had survived decades of pressure, persecution, and public destruction, died in a rented mansion in Los Angeles in circumstances that should never have been possible. A man surrounded by staff, surrounded by security, surrounded by a personal physician whose entire purpose was to keep him alive and healthy. And yet, Michael Jackson did not wake up that morning. And the questions that surround those final hours, the timeline, the phone calls, the decisions that were made and the decisions that were not made, have never been fully, satisfactorily answered. Until now, to understand what happened in those final 24 hours, you have to understand what the weeks before them looked like. Because the morning of June 25 did not arrive in isolation. It arrived at the end of a period that people close to Michael described in terms that ranged from deeply concerning to genuinely alarming. The This Is It tour, 50 concerts at London's O2 Arena, was scheduled to begin on July 13, 2009. 18 days away, and Michael Jackson, by every account from people who were in the rehearsal room with him, was caught between two completely opposing realities. On some days, he was electric, magnetic, the dancer, the performer, the artist who had redefined what live performance could be, was still there. Fully present, impossible to look away from. And on other days, he was something else entirely. Exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Diminished in a way that frightened people who had known him for years. The gap between those two versions of Michael, and the question of which one would show up on July 13, was something nobody around him could answer with confidence. The financial pressure behind the tour was enormous. AEG Live, the promoter, had invested heavily. The 50-show commitment had been negotiated under circumstances that some people close to Michael later described as pressure that crossed the line into coercion. Michael had reportedly wanted fewer shows, had expressed concern about whether his body could handle the schedule, had communicated, in various ways and through various people, that 50 concerts felt like too many. But the contracts were signed. The tickets were sold. The machinery was moving. And Michael Jackson, who had spent his entire life inside machinery that moved whether he was ready or not, was moving with it. But that's not even the craziest part. Stopping it would have cost more than he had left to Michael's body during those final weeks was something that the public rehearsal footage, carefully edited and released after his death in the This Is It documentary, did not fully show. Behind the scenes, people described a man who was not sleeping. Not sleeping in the way that most people understand insomnia, where you lie awake for hours before finally drifting off. But not sleeping in a clinical, dangerous sense. Going days at a stretch without genuine restorative sleep. And the reason was the same reason that had been quietly destroying him for years. The prescription medication dependency that had begun after the 1984 Pepsi burn accident had evolved, across 2.5 decades, into something that had fundamentally altered his body's ability to function without chemical intervention. He could not sleep naturally, had not been able to sleep naturally in years. And the solution that had been found, the solution that Dr. Conrad Murray had been employed, at a reported salary of $150,000 per month, to provide, was propofol. Propofol is not a sleeping medication. That needs to be said clearly and without qualification. Propofol is a surgical anesthetic. The kind used to render patients unconscious for operations. The kind administered in hospital settings with monitoring equipment and trained anesthesiologists standing by. The kind that, when administered incorrectly, or without proper monitoring, or to a patient whose physical condition makes them vulnerable, can stop the heart. Conrad Murray had been administering propofol to Michael Jackson nightly for approximately 6 weeks leading up to June 25. In a bedroom, without monitoring equipment, without the backup systems that any hospital in the world would have required. And Michael, who had been told by at least one other medical professional that this practice was dangerous, that it needed to stop, that his body could not sustain it indefinitely, had continued anyway. Because without it, there was no sleep. And without sleep, there was no tour. And without the tour, there was no way out of the financial situation that the tour was supposed to solve. The night of June 24th began like the nights that had preceded it. Michael returned to the rented Holmby Hills mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive after rehearsals at the Staples Center. By multiple accounts, the rehearsal that day had been one of the better ones. Michael had been engaged, present. People who were there described moments of genuine brilliance, flashes of the performer who had once made the entire world stop and watch. He had worked through several songs, had given notes to dancers and musicians with the precision and authority of someone who knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. And when he left the Staples Center that evening, the people who said goodbye to him had no reason to believe it was the last time. At the mansion, Dr. Conrad Murray was waiting. What happened over the next several hours, between Michael's arrival home and the moment Murray made the phone call that changed everything, is where the story becomes complicated. Contested, reconstructed from testimony, from phone records, from the accounts of people who were in the house and people who were not. What is known is that Murray administered a series of medications to help Michael sleep. Benzodiazepines first, lorazepam, midazolam, medications that should, under ordinary circumstances, have been enough to produce sleep. But Michael's tolerance, built up across years of dependency, meant that ordinary doses no longer produced ordinary effects. And so the medications were administered in quantities that, in combination, represented a level of pharmaceutical load that a body in Michael's condition was struggling to process. And then came the propofol, approximately 25 milligrams, according to Murray's later account, administered intravenously, in a bedroom, without a pulse oximeter properly positioned, without a defibrillator on hand, without the monitoring that the drug's manufacturer explicitly requires. Murray later claimed he stepped away, that he left the room to make phone calls. Phone records subpoenaed during the subsequent criminal trial revealed that Murray had spent a significant portion of the time he was supposed to be monitoring Michael on his phone. Personal calls, calls to women he was romantically involved with, calls that lasted long enough that when he returned to the room and found Michael not breathing, the window for intervention had already narrowed to something close to nothing. What happened next shocked everyone who heard the details in the courtroom. Because Murray did not call 911 immediately, there was a delay that, in the context of cardiac arrest, is not measured in minutes but in the permanent brain damage and cellular death that occurs with every passing second without oxygen. Murray attempted CPR, attempted resuscitation, attempted, according to his own account, to reverse what was happening with the tools available to him in that bedroom. But the tools available to him in that bedroom were not the tools the situation required. And the minutes passed, and at some point, during those minutes, Michael Jackson crossed a threshold from which no amount of medical intervention was going to bring him back. The 911 call came at 12:21 p.m. The recording of that call, played in courtrooms and broadcast across the world, is one of the most disturbing documents in the entire history of this story. Because the voice on the other end of the line, the voice of the man who had been paid $150,000 a month to keep Michael Jackson alive, sounds uncertain. Sounds almost confused about the basic information the dispatcher is asking for. The address of the house has to be obtained from someone else in the building. The instructions being given by the dispatcher, to lay Michael on the floor, to perform proper CPR, are met with responses that suggest Murray either cannot or will not follow them completely. And through the entire call, through every second of that recording, the clock is running. And the window is closing. And in a hospital 18 minutes away, the machines that might have made a difference are sitting unused. Paramedics arrived at 12:26 p.m. They found Michael Jackson on the bed, not on the floor where CPR can be most effectively administered. They found a scene that one paramedic later described, in testimony, as immediately telling them what they were dealing with. They attempted resuscitation, advanced life support, everything in their considerable arsenal, and then they made the decision that paramedics make when the data tells them what they need to know. Michael was transported to UCLA Medical Center, where a team of doctors continued resuscitation efforts for approximately an hour. Where every available intervention was attempted. And where, at 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. The official cause of death, acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication. The manner of death, homicide. Not murder. Homicide. The legal distinction matters. Homicide means one person's actions caused another person's death. It does not require intent. It requires causation, and the causation in this case was not difficult to establish. Conrad Murray had administered the drug. Conrad Murray had left the room. Conrad Murray had failed to monitor his patient. Conrad Murray had failed to call for help in a timely manner. And Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in November 2011. Sentenced to 4 years. Released after 2. A sentence that, to many people who loved Michael Jackson, represented a profound and permanent failure of justice. But here is what the trial and the verdict and the 2-year sentence did not resolve. Did not even fully address. The question of how this situation came to exist in the first place. Because Conrad Murray did not appear in Michael Jackson's life in isolation. He was hired, recruited, placed into a position of intimate medical authority over the most famous entertainer in the world by people who had significant financial interests in keeping that entertainer functional enough to perform 50 concerts. The question of what AEG Live knew, what they should have known, what any reasonable person in a position of responsibility should have recognized about the condition of the man they were depending on to fill those 50 dates, was a question that a subsequent civil lawsuit attempted to answer. And the answers that emerged from that litigation were deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. And this is where things take a truly disturbing turn, because documents and testimony from the civil proceedings painted a picture of an organization that had received warnings, that had seen the signs, that had been told, in various ways and through various channels, that Michael Jackson was not well, that the schedule was too demanding, that the man at the center of the entire financial structure was more fragile than the marketing materials suggested. And the response to those warnings, the institutional response of an organization with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, was not to slow down, was not to reassess, was not to ask the harder questions about whether the human being at the center of all of it was actually okay. The response was to keep moving, to manage the optics, to present the public face of a comeback while the private reality was something else entirely. The final 24 hours of Michael Jackson's life are a mirror. A deeply uncomfortable, impossible to look away from mirror. They reflect back at us something about the machinery that surrounds extraordinary talent. About the financial structures that are built around individual human beings without those human beings always having meaningful control over them. About the ways in which the people closest to someone in crisis can be simultaneously the people with the most power to help and the least incentive to use it. About what happens when a person's value as a commodity exceeds their value as a human being in the calculations of the people responsible for their care. And about what it costs, in the most final, irreversible sense, when those calculations go wrong. Michael Jackson spent his last conscious hours doing what he had always done. Creating, perfecting, reaching for the version of the performance that existed in his imagination and refusing to rest until the reality matched it. The people who were with him at the Staples Center on June 24 describe someone who, in those final rehearsal hours, was entirely himself. Entirely present. Entirely the artist who had changed the world. And then he went home. And the machinery that was supposed to protect him, failed him. Completely. Finally. Permanently. The day the world lost Michael Jackson was not inevitable. That is the thing that makes it impossible to fully accept. It was not a natural death. It was not the unavoidable conclusion of a life lived at extraordinary intensity. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific moments, decisions that could have gone differently, that should have gone differently, and did not. And the questions that remain, about accountability, about the systems that failed, about the people who knew and said nothing and the people who didn't know because they chose not to look, those questions do not have clean answers. They have verdicts. They have settlements. They have press releases and legal documents and carefully worded statements from organizations protecting their reputations. But they do not have answers. Not really. Not the kind that would make any of it make sense. Not the kind that would make June 25, 2009 feel like anything other than what it was. A failure. Of medicine, of industry, of the basic human obligation to see another person clearly, and protect them accordingly. Even when, especially when, that person is the most famous human being on earth.